Hello and welcome to part 2 of the Sociology of Football. Today we're going to look at stratification within football and who fits in where. Part 1 has been really well received, so thank you for those that got in touch. Today we're going to be looking at how football can affect different groups of people in different ways, and how people within football can be split into groups, and essentially how it shows us different concepts around labeling, around dividing people and looking at what unites them, etc., etc. So you may want to think about, where do you fit in when it comes to football? Is it something that's totally alien and outside of your life and what you experience? Is it something very much on the periphery and the fringes? Or is it something that your whole life is built around football, built around the season, built around playing, watching, whatever it might be? And what does that mean? Why is it that way? What can it tell us from a sociological point of view? Now, the concept of deviance in football is like the concept of deviance in society. There are many different ways in which you can be seen as being deviant through football. You might support the wrong team. You might support a minority team. You might support a team that's very unfashionable. You might belong to a minority group within football. Football is very much seen as conservative and not very progressive when it comes to kind of the social aspects in a lot of cultures, in a lot of territories, Britain included. But also fans can dress in a deviant way, can make themselves stand out in a football crowd because of how they dress. You may remember the picture of the Victorian football fans all in their hats and suits. Well, nowadays there's a lot of different ways to dress, and there's a lot of ways you can dress expected to go to a game. It's not all people in the replica kit from that season, etc., etc. And there may well be deviance from the players. You know, there are certain players, certain types of players that the football community loves to hate or loves to see as an anti-hero. Maybe that could be because of their disciplinary record, their style of play, their manner, all sorts of reasons. So you might want to think of many different examples of footballers that have this anti-hero tag or this label of being a bit different, of standing out in some way. And that can show us how deviance is really ingrained in football as it is in any other aspect of society. You may also want to think about why minority groups struggle for acceptance in football. You can see the Pride group here in the top right. My experience of football is that it is still quite homophobic in many ways, and that can be through kind of collective behaviour and an unthinking homophobia to avert hostility. That's something we're going to look at and explore throughout this series as well, and why that might be. Subcultures in football. Football, like any society or any aspect of society, has its subcultures. When you say football fan, a lot of people automatically assume hooligan, and what they might actually mean is what's known as a casual in football. Young men, they have very dedicated terms of fashion, very narrow range of what's fashionable. Certain brands have to be worn, certain styles, and this really came about in the 70s and really strongly in the 80s through to the 90s, as well as the idea of fans going wearing their replica kits. There are football fans that look down on those that wear their replica kits. You may remember the yellow and green scarves at Man United as a protest. I mean, no one likes to see yellow and green anyway together generally, but in terms of, you had fans maybe from the global point of view that would wear the yellow and green scarf but have the Old Trafford megastore bags in their hands spending lots of money, and there'd be a kind of juxtaposition there of fitting in properly. But also, if you think about cages, class, age, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, there are small subcultures within football fans. Just because you support the same club doesn't mean you're the same person. So you may see that in lots of different ways. You know, every ground has a disabled section. There's a lot more rights and a lot more engagement with disabled fans in the modern era. And there's much more visibility towards accommodating disabled fans and helping them meet their needs. And that's a real positive. But is that as a reflection of football, or is that a reflection of society, or is it both? In the bottom right hand corner, you can see Sarpreet Singh, who plays for Bayern Munich in Germany, is born in New Zealand, has Indian parents, and is ethnically a Sikh. I don't know if he's practicing Sikh. A real subculture within football is the background of players. Asian players particularly are seen as sort of an other in the Western game, especially in the same way other races, other nationalities were at one point. But the world's become more global. People move around more, and you can divide people on an ethnic background in football particularly easily. Whether it's fair to do so, whether it's helpful to do so, well, that's a different debate. So, is football any different to society in that way? Clearly not. Why have these subcultures developed? And in terms of fan subcultures, it can be the area, it can be the club, it can be the type of people that follow that club. And you can see that in terms of different regions have different populations. My own club, Ipswich, we're often sort of seen as sleepy and docile because of where we are from in the country. But also there's a lot of elderly fans and a lot of middle-aged fans, and younger fans are steered more towards this idea of having a Premier League club. And you can see that across many, many, many football clubs globally, but within the pyramid as well in England. So that can have a real effect. Population changes, population movements. As a club becomes successful, they attract fans. If those fans stay, their children, it's inherited, as we talked about in the first video. So that can affect the subcultures and how they grow and how they shrink over time. You may already have got to the ideas of Becker and interactionism and labelling when it comes to football. Footballers are labelled in a certain way, as we talked about before. Football fans are too. And the idea of football being a way in which you can reflect upon yourself and sort of call these ideas the looking glass self is really important too. There's a certain prestige of being a really good footballer when you're growing up at school for a lot of boys. I wonder if that's the same for girls, or girls who play sport, if there's a different stigma around that. Certainly this idea that girls that play football or are into sport tend to be lesbians, or there's something different about them, that was a real negative stereotype that was around, and still is around to some respects. Likewise, the idea that, football fans, they're this other, there's this rogue element in society. If you think about going out on a Saturday, not everyone is a football fan, not everyone is going to a game, but those that are perhaps in a minority. If you go to a busy train station where fans are going off to different games around the country, while people are going shopping or going visiting a different city or whatever they might be doing, in certain areas, in certain environments, on that train, there might be a majority of football fans, but in the station, not so much. So then they become less of a group, and it's more noticeable, and these labels can stand out and show us what Becker was talking about. Likewise, the idea of football fans being folk devils, that can come down to this sort of sense of antisocial behaviour, or this risk and this masculinity that comes along with it. So we have that, and recently with the COVID-19 stuff, we've had footballers being outed in the media as kind of greedy and selfish, and they get paid all this money and they should be donating it to the NHS. And footballers have had some very negative press because of that. So you can see labelling constantly comes back to the status of the footballer, who they are, where they fit in society, and the football fan, and that can all lead into a lot of different sociological topics too. Now, one area where we see labelling and football really come together is this idea of football violence. There is a difference between hooligans and ultras, for example, within fan subcultures, and there's a different timeline and a different emphasis on what those words mean to football fans a lot of the time. But in larger society, they're seen as one and the same. So football violence is often linked to racism, is often linked to tribalism and hatred of the other, and many other negative things, and rightly so. Football violence was a huge problem in Britain, particularly in the 1980s. And hooligans tend to mean organised groups of football fans that use football as a vehicle for their violence, to have organised fights. The game is less important, and there's a whole set of media and kind of factual-based research, as well as what I call more the romantic stuff, books, films, TV series, that kind of idea, which play on these stereotypes and assumptions. So ultras tend to come from Italy as a concept, but were really influenced by the Brazilians of the 1950 World Cup, as I understand it. And it's this idea of, the Latin going beyond. So you take your fandom to 7 days a week, 24/7, and ultras is about organising positive representation of your club, and you see flags, you see banners, you see what we call tifos, big displays, orchestrated by people at the front. And this is a big part of the culture in a lot of countries. In Britain, it's slightly different, you could argue. You don't see so many ultras per se. That's changing. They're becoming more visible. But you see, with ultras, it's about non-violence, as it were, I would argue, from my understanding of it. Crime in football isn't just linked to violence. You have match betting scandals, you have corruption, you have bribery, the white collar crimes as well. And if you think about Foucault and power, police clashing with football fans is something we saw in the 80s. It's something we see a lot. If you've ever been to a game abroad, like I have, an English football fan is often treated very, very tersely by police. You're closely monitored, you're marching out of stadiums, and that happens in England too. So there's this connotation that there's an undercurrent of violence in all football crowds, in all football fandom, which is perhaps unfair, but it does show the power of labelling and stigma that we've looked at before. So when you're looking at how these labels can stick in this master status, football violence and criminality around football is a really important idea. Likewise, fan groups, ultras and hooligans, can have criminal elements within them. If you look at sort of the story of Napoli fans, for example, and the stereotypes around the mafia within Naples and how that's linked to the club, you can see how those worlds overlap. And this is perfect for sociology because it shows how football, crime, identity and status, they don't exist in vacuums. They're all interlinked like a Venn diagram. So you can use football to explore other issues, and as long as you're careful, you can show accurately the effect of those two without ironically labelling and stigmatising everybody. Racism in football is a very, very difficult topic, and if you want to ask, does football have a racism issue, you may want to ask, does society have a racism issue? And there will be different responses and different actions in different countries. So England's first black footballer wasn't called up until the 1970s. That's a long, long time of black people being in Britain, living in Britain, being part of society. Similarly, I talked earlier about a lack of representation of Asian footballers, despite Britain having a relatively large Asian community. You can't see it in the picture, but the second one along, the man is holding a banana. This is a common taunt at black players, which goes back to the football violence of the 80s we talked about. Likewise, you can see Chelsea fans racially abusing Raheem Sterling in that picture. And at a World Cup, players stood around a "Say No to Racism" banner. Football has so many different organisations, so many different policies, much like the government, statements around racism not being tolerated, but racism still happens, racism is still expressed. And the agencies of social control, the police, the governing bodies of the game, even the referees, don't always have a handle on it. In Portugal, in Italy, we've had African players or even just black players from that country being racially abused, walking off in tears, controversially being dragged back by players, by managers, by referees, or punished for walking off. And this has shown football in a bad light. The idea of monkey gestures and monkey chants, this happens in games around the world still, unfortunately. But is that a representation of that society? Is it a representation of that club? That's a difficult one to say. But why does it happen? Why is it within a crowd people feel that they could do these sorts of things? You don't walk down the high street chanting and singing songs at people you see, but you do it at opposition fans, at players, at referees when you're at a game. So you can see that and say, well, racism is just another form of that deviant behaviour, if you like. But not all fans tolerate it. It's not accepted widely that if you start a racist chant at a football ground, everyone's going to join in. Quite the opposite. So it's like any other social situation in that respect. It's managed informally. by peer groups, by the people around you, and that's something to bear in mind too. As with other negative things that we've talked about, sexism and homophobia exist in football like they exist in society. There are groups which promote female fans, LGBT fans, and you may ask, well, what's the need of that? It's no different to any other aspect of society, I would argue. And the fact that these groups exist in football, for me personally, is a positive move, but it shows a diversity, it shows a stratification. The treatment of women in football is really interesting. The last World Cup, FIFA said that it was about a 70-30 split. I don't know if the graph's very clear in terms of male to female fans, about 70% watching. Yeah, any TV coverage of the FIFA World Cup, you will see pretty girls focused on by the camera, you know, when there's cuts in play and stuff like that. You might want to ask you questions, well, why is that? What does that show? Is that now outdated? Similarly, you know, Altrincham FC had a rainbow kit in support of LGBT. You have rainbow laces days and corner flags and things like that to sort of promote the visibility of the LGBT community in football. And there's still homophobic songs sung at football. There's still sexist chants and songs sung at football. You know, I grew up in an era where any woman who went to football or was seen walking by the pitch side, for example, could be subjected to all kinds of sort of boorish and sexist chants, which I won't repeat here. Similarly, when Brighton play, because Brighton has a large gay community, their fans are often subject to homophobic abuse. Norwich had an openly gay player in Justin Fashanu, who was also black. They're holding a banner up there to commemorate him long after he committed suicide, unfortunately. So you can see that the game, in terms of minorities, isn't representative of society, and there aren't any gay footballers really in the game that are open comparatively to the rest of society. In the men's football particularly, women's it's slightly different, and you can refer back to the earlier stereotypes we talked about. But the women's game is still in a growth period compared to the men's. So football and sexism and homophobia, does it reflect society, or is it amplifying deviance? Is it amplifying negativity? That's an interesting debate you can have when you study it. That said, you know, although Justin Fashanu was the first footballer who was out in the men's game, you know, people like Thomas Hitzelsberger has come out since retiring, which is some kind of positive progress, you may argue. Robbie Rogers, who I believe played for Leeds and mostly is American, he was playing in America and was out during his playing career. But the fact that we're talking about this sort of exceptionalism is really interesting, and the fact that women's football seems to have a different attitude is also really interesting. So you may want to reflect on what that tells us about the difference in gender and masculinity and culture, and bring those sociological ideas out. This is an issue I would recommend you do further reading on, particularly if you're really interested in getting to the bottom of it. So feminist ideas applied to football would be really fascinating study to look at. Male football and male footballers are worth more than female footballers in monetary terms. Now, the moral judgment around that is one for you to make. There are massive debates. You may know Megan Rapinoe, the captain of the American women's team. Well, in America, the female game is much more high profile than the men's game, traditionally speaking. But there's been a huge debate and a huge argument around equal pay for the US women's team versus the US men's team. And from a legal challenge that's been going on, the governing body in America has kind of said, no, the men are worth more, which has caused a huge amount of offence. In British society, perhaps, or in a lot of other societies, that wouldn't raise as many eyebrows. You need to ask, why is that? Why would most people argue, well, actually, men's football, you know, they deserve these higher salaries. They bring in much more money. They generate much more TV revenue, ticket sales, etc., etc. So, from a feminist point of view, is football kind of an ultra patriarchal aspect of society? You can think about the gender gap, the glass ceiling, you know, all of these things which feminists argue and which you will have studied. Is that magnified? Is that really expanded by football? And why is that? What is it about football that does that? The idea that women in the stand should be equal to men, it's not happening so much. You know, particularly in the girls have gone to football, women have gone to football for decades. That has happened, but they, as a minority, have grown. There are a higher proportion of football fans, I would argue, going to games, and from what I've observed, but also statistically, you can see that. So you may want to argue why that is. And are girls being taken from a young age, like I was, and sort of going for life, or are they going as wives and girlfriends and becoming, you know, a kind of an accompanying partner to their husbands? That would be something that feminists might look at. And what does that mean? You know, I'm not saying that is the trend. I'm just asking the question, because if you had a feminist looking at it, they might argue, well, this shows more patriarchy, this shows more sexism, it shows that football is ingrained in that way. Again, this is a massive, massive topic and way beyond the scope of just one video. I hope that this has allowed you to think about the studies that you know, to think about the ideas that you've learned, and to go off and read yourself and see how you can apply sociology to all these different aspects of football that you may not have considered before. As always, thank you for watching. Please leave me comments, please leave me questions, you know, below in the Google Classroom, etc. I'm really keen to hear your thoughts on this and whether it helps you understand sociology a little bit more.